Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Easy English Spark channel. I'm thrilled to have you join us today. I hope you're ready for an exciting adventure as we dive into an amazing story that will not only keep you hooked, but also help you sharpen your English listening and speaking skills. Get ready to boost your confidence and speak English more fluently than ever before. Let's jump right in and light up your English journey with this fantastic tale. Chapter 1: Robinson's Ambition. My name is Robinson Crusoe. I was born in a small, quiet town on the coast of England. My family, although loving, never quite understood my dreams. My father was a businessman, practical and steady, always encouraging me to follow the traditional path, learn the trade, work hard, and live a life of stability. He told me, "Robinson, a life at sea is dangerous and unpredictable. The world out there is not for you. You should stay here, follow in my footsteps, and inherit the family business. This is where you belong." But from a very young age, I felt a yearning, a longing for something beyond the ordinary. I'd sit for hours, staring at the horizon from our home by the sea, dreaming of the lands beyond, the adventures waiting out there. I didn't want to live a quiet, predictable life. I wanted to explore the world, to see places no one in my family had ever seen, to live life on my own terms. My mother was different. She saw the fire in my heart, the dreams that burned brighter than any conventional path. She was kind, always supportive, but even she couldn't protect me from my father's constant insistence. Still, my mind was made up. When I turned 18, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I went to my father and told him that I was going to leave England and see the world. He was furious, of course. He begged me to stay, told me I was being reckless, and that I didn't understand the danger and hardship I'd face. He even promised me a future with his business if I would just stay. But I couldn't. My heart was set on adventure, and no matter how much I loved my family, I knew that my path lay elsewhere. So, with a heavy heart, I packed my belongings, said goodbye to my family, and left. I boarded a ship bound for London, eager to begin my journey. As I sailed away from the familiar shores of England, I felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. For the first time in my life, I was on my own, free to pursue whatever the world had in store for me. But my journey didn't go smoothly. The seas were rough, and the crew was filled with men who had seen the worst of the world. I realized quickly that the life of a sailor was not as glamorous as I had imagined. The ship was filled with hard men, hardened by the dangers of the sea, and I felt out of place. My naivety, my lack of experience, made me an easy target for mockery. One day, during a particularly violent storm, I stood on deck, holding onto the ship's rail, my heart racing as the waves crashed around me. The wind howled, and the ship creaked under the pressure. The seasoned sailors barely flinched, but I was terrified. In that moment, I realized how unprepared I was for this life. It wasn't the grand adventure I had imagined, but a constant battle against nature's fury. That night, I lay in my bunk, unable to sleep. The sound of the storm outside was deafening, and my mind raced with thoughts of what I had left behind and what lay ahead. My father's voice echoed in my ears, telling me how foolish I was to leave, how dangerous the world outside could be. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't let fear dictate my life. I had made my choice, and there was no turning back now. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the ship was battered, its sails torn and tattered. The crew was exhausted, but the captain, a grizzled man with a face weathered by years at sea, gave orders to continue on our journey. It was a harsh reminder that life on the sea was far from easy. It was a test of endurance, courage, and willpower. As we sailed on, I began to question my decision. Was I really cut out for this life? But deep down, I knew I had to keep going. My ambition, my desire to see the world, was stronger than any doubt. I couldn't let myself turn back now. The journey I had begun was bigger than any fear I had, and so I pressed on, knowing that my dream of adventure was still out there, waiting for me, even if the path to it was uncertain and full of challenges. My ambition had led me this far, and it would be my guide in the days to come. This was just the beginning of my journey, one that would test my resolve, change my life, and push me to my limits. But I was ready, or so I told myself. The world awaited, and I would meet it head-on no matter the cost. And so, my adventure began, as I set my sights on the unknown, driven by the ambition that had always burned within me. Chapter 2. The First Adventure. After leaving the familiar shores of England, I embarked on my first real adventure. The ship, a sturdy merchant vessel named the Venture, had a mixed crew of experienced sailors and novices like myself. I had no idea what to expect from life at sea, but I was eager to begin. The excitement was palpable as we sailed away from the port, and I could feel the promise of adventure in the air. The first few days at sea were surprisingly calm. The crew went about their duties with ease, the ship cutting smoothly through the water. I tried to stay out of the way, observing the sailors, learning their ways, but mostly trying to avoid making any mistakes. My lack of experience was glaring, and I knew that I had much to prove if I was to gain their respect. I spent my days assisting with the simple tasks, learning to coil ropes, help hoist the sails, and scrub the deck. Each task felt monumental, as if I were learning a new language, The sailors looked at me with amusement, often giving me small tasks to test my resolve. I quickly realized that life at sea was not the carefree adventure I had imagined. It was grueling, physical work, and the days were long and repetitive, but I didn't mind. I was still filled with the excitement of being out in the open ocean, the vastness of it all. The sky above me was endless, and I felt like I was on the edge of something grand, something bigger than myself. The salty air, the sound of the waves, crashing against the ship's hull, it all felt so freeing, so raw. That was until the storm hit. It started as a sudden shift in the wind. One minute, the sea was calm, and the next, the waves began to swell ominously, towering over the ship. The crew didn't panic. They went into action, securing the sails and preparing the ship for the worst. The captain, a grizzled man named Captain Reynolds, shouted orders with a voice that cut through the chaos, his face as hardened as the wood of the ship. I stood frozen at first, unsure of what to do. The storm came on so quickly, I barely had time to react. The wind howled like an animal on a hunt, and the waves crashed over the deck, spraying water in all directions. The ship creaked and groaned under the pressure, the sails flapping violently in the gusts. I was terrified, not knowing if we would make it through the night. The crew was scrambling, working in perfect synchrony, as if they had all been through storms like this before. But I was no seasoned sailor. My legs wobbled as I tried to find my balance, my stomach turning with every violent toss of the ship. My heart raced in fear. I had read stories of sailors being swallowed by the sea, of ships capsizing in the blink of an eye. Now, those stories seemed all too real. I tried to help, grabbing ropes and securing anything I could, but I was useless. My hands were trembling, and my mind was in a haze. I didn't know how to act in a storm like this. All I could do was hold on and hope that the ship would hold, together long enough for us to survive. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. The storm showed no sign of letting up, and the ship was being tossed about like a toy in the water. I thought about my family back home, about my father's words, and I wondered if I had made the right choice by leaving. Maybe I wasn't cut out for this. Maybe I wasn't ready for the life I had chosen. As the night wore on, the storm seemed to reach its peak. The ship pitched so violently that I had to cling to anything I could find. The wind screamed through. The rigging and the rain stung my face like needles. I had never experienced anything like this before. The sound of the storm was deafening, a constant roar that seemed to shake the very bones of the ship. Then, just as I thought we couldn't take any more, it happened. A crack, a deafening snap, sounded above the storm's roar. The mast, it had snapped under the pressure of the wind. and the sails flapped wildly in the air like a dying bird. Panic spread through the crew. We were no longer in control. Captain Reynolds barked orders, his voice cutting through the chaos. The crew scrambled to secure the ship, but it was clear that the storm was far from over. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and for a moment I was convinced that we wouldn't survive. The ship was no longer in the fight. It was a helpless creature tossed about by the fury of the ocean. I remember thinking that if we made it through the night, I would never take the sea for granted again. This wasn't the adventure I had imagined. This was something far darker, something that showed no mercy. My mind raced as I clung to the rail, my knuckles white, every muscle in my body aching from the strain. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm began to subside. The winds died down, and the rain eased into a soft drizzle. The sea, once an unforgiving beast, began to calm. I stood there, soaked to the bone, staring out at the vast ocean. It felt almost unnatural, this sudden calm after the chaos. We had made it through the storm. The ship was battered, but it was still afloat. The crew, though exhausted, was alive. We all stood on deck, silently acknowledging the magnitude of what we had just endured. I was no longer just a boy from a small town with a dream of adventure. I was a sailor who had survived his first real test at sea. As the sky cleared, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a warm light on the water. It was a beautiful sight, but I couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that clung to me. The storm had been a reminder that the sea was unpredictable, unforgiving. It would test us again, that much was certain. But despite my fear, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. I had made my choice. The storm had tested me, had shown me the harsh realities of the sea, but it had also solidified my resolve. I was here for the adventure, for the life I had dreamed of. The storm had only made me more determined to face whatever came next. I had survived. And in that moment, I realized that this was just the beginning of my journey. Chapter 3: Pirates and Betrayal. The days that followed the storm were filled with a sense of unease. The sea had calmed, but the damage to the Venture was evident. The ship's mast was snapped in half, and several sails were torn beyond repair. The crew worked tirelessly to make temporary repairs, but it was clear that we wouldn't be able to continue our journey without further assistance. Captain Reynolds, who had remained stoic throughout the storm, was now visibly agitated. He paced back and forth on the deck, occasionally barking orders to the crew. He seemed to be lost in thought, as if contemplating the next move, but his stern demeanor gave no indication of whether he was optimistic or worried. I too felt uneasy. The feeling in my gut told me that something wasn't right. The storm had left us vulnerable, and in this treacherous world of the sea, vulnerability often meant danger. One night, as I stood at the ship's railing, staring into the endless black of the ocean, a small shadow moved across the deck. I squinted into the darkness, unsure if I was seeing things. Then, I heard a faint rustle, followed by a low voice. My heart skipped a beat. There was someone else on the ship, someone who wasn't part of the crew. Before I could react, the sound of footsteps grew louder, and I turned just in time to see a figure slip into the shadows. It was one of the sailors, but not one I recognized. He wore a dark cloak that seemed to swallow the moonlight. His eyes glinted, and his expression was cold, calculating. He didn't look like a man who had just survived a deadly storm. He looked like a man with a plan. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The figure froze for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the ship's lower deck without a word. A sense of dread washed over me. I could feel it deep in my bones. This was no ordinary sailor. Something was wrong. The next morning, things started to take a darker turn. The crew, although still working, was now more nervous than ever. Whispers spread like wildfire through the ranks. The crew had been talking about strange sightings during the night, and a few men had heard unusual noises coming from below deck. Something was clearly off. Captain Reynolds gathered the crew on deck, his voice low and tense. "We've been compromised," he said, his voice carrying the weight of an unspoken truth. "There are pirates in these waters, and I fear we've already been spotted. We need to stay vigilant." A murmur of concern ran through the sailors. Pirates. The mere mention of them brought a chill to the air. Pirates weren't just thieves. They were ruthless killers, and the sea was their domain. We were stranded, vulnerable, and now it seemed we were being hunted. The crew doubled its watch, but that evening, as I was helping with the ship's repairs, the true threat made itself known. In the dead of night, a sharp cry echoed through the ship. The sound of swords clashing and desperate shouts filled the air. Panic swept through the crew. I scrambled up the ladder to the deck, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the top, I saw them. Pirates. They were swarming onto the Venture, like a pack of wolves, their dark figures silhouetted against the moonlight. I barely had time to register the chaos before a pirate grabbed me from behind. He was strong, his hands like iron, and before I knew it, I was thrown to the ground. The pirate's face was covered with a black mask, but I could see the madness in his eyes. He raised a dagger high, preparing to strike, but a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Captain Reynolds. "Get back!" he shouted, drawing his cutlass in one swift motion. He swung it with a ferocity I hadn't seen before, knocking the pirate back. The crew rallied behind him, and a brutal battle broke out on the deck. The clash of metal on metal rang out as the pirates and the sailors fought for control of the ship. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. I knew I had to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear. This wasn't the adventure I had imagined. This was real danger, and I was caught in the middle of it. Amidst the chaos, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the pirates was standing at the ship's helm, a figure that seemed eerily familiar. It was the same man I had seen the night before, the one with the dark cloak. His eyes locked with mine across the battlefield, and a wicked grin spread across his face. Suddenly, it clicked. The man wasn't just a pirate, he was one of us. He had been among the crew the entire time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He was a traitor. My heart sank. We had been betrayed. One of our own had sold us out to the pirates, and now they had taken control of the ship. "Reynolds!" I shouted, rushing toward the captain. But before I could reach him, a pirate grabbed me again, this time pulling me toward the side of the ship. I kicked and screamed, trying to break free, but it was no use. The pirate's grip was unrelenting. Captain Reynolds, now surrounded by pirates, was fighting valiantly, but it was clear he was outnumbered. His cutlass slashed through the air, but the pirates kept coming, more of them pouring over the ship's sides. In the midst of the chaos, I heard the traitor's voice, cold and mocking. "You should have stayed in England, Crusoe. This was always the plan. We needed the ship, and now it's ours." He laughed as he advanced toward the captain, who was struggling to hold his ground. But the traitor wasn't finished. He swung his blade, striking Captain Reynolds across the chest. The captain collapsed, blood spilling from the wound. I watched in horror as the pirates bound the remaining crew, taking us all captive. The traitor approached me, his eyes glinting with malice. "You didn't think it would be so easy, did you?" he sneered. "You thought you were on a grand adventure, but you were nothing more than a pawn in our game." The pirates took control of the ship, and my world turned upside down. What had started as a journey for freedom had become a nightmare of betrayal, bloodshed, and loss. We were no longer in control of our fate. The ship was in the hands of the pirates, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. But even in that moment of despair, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't give up. I had to find a way out of this. I had to survive. This wasn't the end of my adventure. It was only the beginning of a new kind of struggle, one that would test my resolve in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The pirates had taken control, but I still had my wits, and I wasn't about to surrender to them. I would find a way to escape. I would survive this betrayal. And somehow, I would turn this disaster into my next great adventure. Chapter 4. shipwrecked on an unknown island. The pirates' attack was swift and brutal. By the time the sun rose, the battle was over. The Venture had been overrun, and the remaining crew, including me, were taken as prisoners. The traitor among us, the man I had seen in the shadows, led the pirates with a cold, calculating demeanor. We were bound and forced into the lower decks of the ship, left to stew in our fear and uncertainty. The pirates didn't waste any time. Their captain, a man named Blackstone, who had a rough, scarred face, called the shots. He and his crew made it clear that we were at their mercy. Any resistance was met with violence. The traitor, whose name I later learned was Mallory, seemed to enjoy watching us struggle. But there was nothing we could do. We were at their mercy, and the ship was now theirs. Days passed in this grim captivity. The pirates kept us in chains, only allowing us to move when necessary. I spent my days thinking about what had happened, about how I had ended up in this nightmare. The grand adventure I had dreamed of now seemed so distant, replaced by fear and hopelessness. But I refused to accept that this would be my fate. I had to keep my mind sharp, to find a way to survive. Then, just as I thought we might be trapped, on the pirate ship forever, a new disaster struck. It started with a shift in the wind, then a sudden drop in temperature. The sky, once clear and blue, darkened with ominous clouds. The pirates, sensing the change in the weather, grew nervous. Blackstone and his crew scrambled to secure the sails, shouting orders to each other, but there was an unsettling urgency to their movements. They had been on the sea long enough to know when trouble was coming. The storm hit without warning. The winds howled like a wild beast, tearing at the sails, while waves crashed against the ship's hull with a force I had never seen. The pirates, though seasoned sailors, were no match for the fury of the storm. The ship groaned under the pressure, its timbers creaking as if they might snap at any moment. I was thrown from one side of the ship to the other, the chains rattling against the wood as I struggled to stay on my feet. The ship tilted dangerously, and the sound of the waves crashing against the sides filled the air, drowning out all other noises. I could feel the ship's movements becoming erratic, as if it were being tossed like a rag doll in the hands of the sea. I had never experienced anything like it before. I thought we were doomed. Blackstone barked orders, but his voice was barely audible over the roar of the storm. He was clearly struggling to keep control, and I could see the fear in his eyes for the first time. The pirates, usually so confident, now looked helpless. There was no longer any pretense of dominance. The sea had become the true master of the ship. The wind howled, and the ship was tossed higher and higher into the air, only to be slammed back down by the crashing waves. Water began to pour over the deck, and soon the lower levels of the ship began to flood. I could hear the pirates shouting to each other in panic as the ship started to take on water. Even Mallory, the trader, looked nervous as the storm raged on. I had no idea how long the storm lasted. Hours, perhaps. Time seemed to stretch and bend, the night and day blending into one unending blur. All I could focus on was surviving. The pirates had no more power over the ship, no more control over the sea. We were at the mercy of nature. The next thing I remember is the feeling of the ship lurching to one side with a violent force. I was thrown across the deck, landing hard against the wet, slippery boards. The sound of splintering wood rang in my ears as I looked up to see the mast bending at an impossible angle. The ship was sinking. We were going down. I didn't think. I reacted. I scrambled toward the edge of the ship, pushing past pirates and fellow prisoners alike. Some of the pirates had already abandoned ship, diving into the stormy sea, while others tried desperately to save the vessel. But it was clear that we were too late. The ship was doomed. I had no choice but to jump. The cold water hit me like a slap to the face as I plunged into the sea. For a moment, I was disoriented, gasping for air as I flailed in the churning water. The storm still raged above, but now all I could focus on was staying afloat. My clothes weighed me down, the water filling my boots and dragging me under. Panic surged in my chest as I fought to keep my head above water. I could hear shouting in the distance, but the storm drowned out everything. Then, as I kicked and thrashed, I saw something in the distance, a dark shape rising out of the water. It was a piece of wreckage, a part of the venture that had broken off and was floating in the water. With every ounce of strength, I swam toward it, my arms aching, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached the wreckage, I clung to it, desperately, the cold water seeping into my bones. As the minutes passed, I began to feel the weight of exhaustion pulling me under. I had no idea how long I'd been in the water, but I knew I couldn't hold on much longer. Just as I thought, I might lose consciousness. I saw a small island in the distance, a tiny speck on the horizon, barely visible through the rain. It was my only hope. Summoning every last bit of strength, I paddled toward the island, using the wreckage to keep myself afloat. The storm continued to rage around me, but somehow I was still alive. I pushed through the waves, fighting against the current, my body numb with cold. After what felt like an eternity, I finally made it to the shore. My legs barely held me as I stumbled onto the beach, collapsing onto the sand. The storm was still furious in the distance, but here, on this small, unknown island, I was safe for the moment. I lay there for a long time, my body aching and battered, the salt water burning my skin. I had no idea where I was, how far I had drifted, or if anyone else had survived. The only thing I knew for certain was that I was alive. For now, that was enough. As I looked out at the vast, empty ocean, I realized that my journey had taken an unexpected turn. I was stranded on an island, alone, with no idea of what to do next. But I had survived. And as I lay on the sand, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, I made a promise to myself. I would not let this island defeat me. I would survive no matter what it took. I had been shipwrecked on an unknown island, but this was just the beginning of my new adventure. Chapter 5. Mastery of the Island. The storm had left me stranded on an unknown island, alone, with nothing but the wreckage of the venture to keep me company. As I stood on the shore, exhausted and trembling, I couldn't help but feel the weight of my situation. The ship was gone, and with it, any hope of rescue. The pirates, the traitor Mallory, and even the crew, they were all lost to the sea. I was completely alone. For a moment, I considered giving up. The island stretched out before me, an untamed wilderness of dense trees, jagged rocks, and sandy beaches. The storm had passed, but the air was heavy with the scent of salt water, and the sky was still gray. The waves lapped against the shore, indifferent to my plight. I had no supplies, no tools, no idea how to survive in this foreign land. But then I remembered my father's words, the words that had haunted me throughout my journey. The world is not kind to those who are weak. I had made it this far. On my own, hadn't I? I had survived the storm, the wreck, and now I had to survive this. The island would not defeat me. I would make it my home, or I would die trying. I took a deep breath and pushed the doubt aside. It was time to act. My first priority was shelter. The island's thick jungle offered some protection from the elements, but it was no place to make a camp. I needed something solid, something that would keep me safe from the animals, from the weather, and from whatever else the island might throw at me. I began to search the shoreline for any useful materials. I scavenged the wreckage of the Venture, pulling what I could from the remains of the ship. There were planks of wood, rope, and even a few tools, axes, knives, and hammers, all of which would be invaluable. The storm had scattered much of the debris along the beach, and I spent hours gathering what I could. I knew that every item I found could mean the difference between life and death. With my supplies in hand, I ventured into the island's dense interior. The jungle was thick with vines and towering trees that blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving the ground cool and damp. The air was filled with the sounds of birds and insects, and the scent of wet earth was overpowering. It was a beautiful, wild place, but also a dangerous one. There were animals in the jungle, creatures that I had no knowledge of. I would need to stay cautious and aware. I found a small clearing near a stream, its waters clear and fresh. This would be the perfect spot for my shelter. The sound of the water flowing over the rocks was soothing, and the area offered some protection from the wind and the elements. I set to work immediately, using the tools I had salvaged to cut down some of the smaller trees and clear a space for a hut. The construction of the shelter was harder than I had expected. My hands, though calloused, from my work on the ship, were not used to the kind of labor required to build a shelter from scratch. I had no experience in building anything like this, but I was determined. I used the ropes from the shipwreck to tie together the wooden beams, weaving vines into the structure to reinforce it. It took me days to complete the basic frame, but finally I had a shelter, rough but functional. As I worked, I learned to adapt to the island. Every day was a lesson in survival. I learned which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous. I learned how to fish in the stream, using a sharpened stick as a spear. I learned how to make a fire from dry wood and flint, and how to keep it burning through the night. I began to hunt the small animals of the island, using the tools I had made to trap them. I was no longer just a shipwrecked man. I was becoming a master of the island. But survival wasn't just about gathering food and building shelter. I knew that the island could be a hostile place, and I needed to be prepared for anything. The jungle, though beautiful, was full of dangers. There were large predators, and the unknown threats of the island were always looming. Every day, I made sure to fortify my shelter, adding defenses to protect myself from any potential attack. I spent countless hours sharpening my tools, making weapons from the materials I could find, spearheads, knives, and even a crude bow and arrows. I knew that I would need these tools not just for hunting, but for protection. The island was wild, and there was no telling what I might face. As I became more comfortable on the island, I began to feel a strange sense of pride. The wilderness that had once seemed so alien was now my domain. I had tamed it to a degree. I had learned its secrets, its rhythms, and its dangers. I could see the beauty in its wildness, but I also knew to respect it. The island had given me everything I needed to survive, but it had also tested me at every turn. I kept a journal of my progress, writing down my observations and plans. It became my way of making sense of this new life, my way of recording the changes I was undergoing. There were days when I felt like a different person, a man forged by the hardships of the island. The man who had arrived here, desperate and broken, was no more. I had become someone else entirely. One afternoon, as I sat by the stream, sharpening my spear, I saw something that made my heart race, a set of footprints in the sand, not far from the water's edge. The prints were fresh and they were large. Someone else was on the island. The discovery sent a chill down my spine. I had been alone on this island for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to share a space with someone else. But now, as I stared at the footprints, I realized I was not alone. There was another person here. My mind raced. Who were they? Were they friend or foe? Were they part of the pirate's crew? Or were they another survivor, stranded like me? I knew I had to act quickly. I had to prepare, to make sure that whatever happened next, I would be ready. The island had already shown me its dangers, and now it seemed that it had more in store for me. But I would face whatever it was head on. I had mastered the island, and now I would face its newest challenge. I wasn't going to be a victim anymore. I was going to take control of my fate, just as I had with the island. The footprints in the sand were a reminder of the uncertainty that still awaited me, but also a reminder that I was no longer the man who had washed ashore in fear. I was Robinson Crusoe, and I would survive, no matter the odds. Chapter 6. Loneliness and Reflection. The days stretched endlessly, like the sand on the beach, slipping through my fingers no matter how hard I tried to hold on. Alone on this island, the overwhelming silence was deafening. It wasn't the kind of quiet that soothes or brings peace. It was a silence that gnawed at the edges of my mind, a constant reminder of my solitude. I had once dreamed of adventure, of seeing the world. But now I was trapped in a reality of my own making, surrounded by the vast, empty ocean. The wreckage of the venture was nothing more than a broken memory, scattered across the shore like pieces of a life I could no longer recall. At first, the work kept me busy. Building shelter, gathering food, and learning to survive had been my focus. But now, with the necessities of life under control, the quiet began to settle in like a heavy fog. There was no one to talk to, no one to share this experience with. My mind began to wander, and I found myself thinking about things I hadn't thought about in years, things that had once seemed so important, but now felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else's life. I found myself asking the same question over and over. What now? Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. I had learned to live off the land, using the tools I had crafted and the knowledge I had gained from both my life at sea and my survival instincts. But as my body grew stronger, my mind grew weaker. The isolation took its toll on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. There were no conversations to pass the time, no laughter to break the monotony. I had no one to share my successes with, no one to help shoulder the burden of survival. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees the occasional crash of a wave against the rocks, and the haunting call of a bird from somewhere deep in the jungle, it felt like I had become a part of the island, blending into the landscape until I was no longer sure where I ended and the island began. It was on one of these quiet days that I found myself sitting on the beach, staring out at the horizon, the place where the sky met the sea, where dreams and reality seemed to merge. I had built my shelter, a strong, weathered structure that had withstood the elements. I had crafted weapons and tools for hunting. I had made a fire, which I kept burning with the dry wood I had gathered from the jungle. But none of it filled the emptiness in my heart. I thought about my family, my parents, my siblings. Were they still alive? Did they miss me? Had they moved on, or had they given up hope, believing me lost forever in the sea? I wondered if they even remembered my face. Would they recognize me if I ever made it back? Would I even remember them? There was a deep pain in my chest whenever I thought of them, a yearning to see them again, to hear their voices, to share the memories of home. I remembered the sound of my mother's laughter, the way my father's voice had always grounded me, made me feel safe. It had been years since I had heard either of them, and I couldn't help but wonder if they had been grieving for me, or if they had moved on with their lives. The isolation made me reflect on everything. I thought about the choices I had made, the reasons I had set out on this journey. I had left England in search of something more, something greater than the life I had known. I wanted adventure, excitement, and freedom. But now, in the quiet of the island, I wondered if I had truly understood what I was seeking. Had I been running from something? Was it the pressure of society? The expectations placed on me by my family? Or was it just the desire for something different, for a life that wasn't bound by rules and restrictions? In the stillness of the island, I began to see the truth of my own loneliness. It wasn't just that I was physically alone. I was also emotionally disconnected from everything I had once known. I had no one to share my thoughts with. No one to laugh with or cry with. No one to tell me that everything would be okay. The island, despite being beautiful and wild, felt like a prison. A beautiful prison, but a prison nonetheless. And yet, despite the pain of loneliness, there was a certain clarity that came with it. It was in the silence that I began to understand who I truly was, free from the distractions of civilization and society. I had no one else to rely on but myself. The island had forced me to confront my own fears, my own weaknesses, and my own desires. There was no hiding from the truth here. I had thought that my greatest challenge would be surviving the island, finding food, building shelter, and fighting off the dangers that lurked in the jungle. But now, I realized that the greatest challenge was not the physical survival. It was the survival of the mind. The island had tested my resilience, yes, but it had also tested my ability to be alone with myself. The longer I stayed, the more I understood the depth of my solitude. At times, the loneliness was unbearable. There were moments when I would scream into the wind, hoping that someone, anyone, would hear me. I would stand at the edge of the beach, looking out at the endless ocean, wondering if there was any chance of rescue, if there was anyone out there who would come for me. But the sea was empty, silent. It offered no answers. I thought about the pirates, about the traitor Mallory, and the crew of the Venture. They were gone, lost to the storm. I had no idea if any of them had survived. The thought of Mallory, the man who had betrayed us, haunted me. How could he live with what he had done? How could anyone betray those who had once been their comrades? But I knew I couldn't dwell on that. There was no point in holding on to anger or resentment. The island had forced me to let go of everything. I had no choice but to move forward, to find peace with what had happened, and to accept my new reality. As the weeks turned into months, I began to establish a routine. It was the only way to maintain some semblance of sanity. I would wake up, with the first light of dawn, tend to the fire, and then go hunting or fishing for the day's food. In the afternoons, I would gather wood for the fire, sharpen my tools, and work on improving my shelter. It was hard, grueling work, but it kept my mind occupied. The physical labor was the only thing that kept me from drowning in my thoughts. But even in the routine, there were moments when the loneliness would hit me hard. There would be no warning, a sudden memory of my family, a brief flash of the world I had left behind. And then, just as quickly, the emptiness would return, settling over me like a heavy blanket. I began to talk to myself. It was strange at first, but it became a way to keep my mind sharp, to give voice to the thoughts that were constantly swirling in my head. I would recount stories from my past, tell myself about the things I had seen and done. It was a way of keeping my memories alive, of keeping a connection to the world I had lost. The island was vast, and the jungle was thick. But every day I ventured further. I learned its paths, its dangers, and its rhythms. I started to notice the small things, the way the wind changed direction before a storm, the pattern of the birds as they flew overhead, the tracks of animals that passed through the jungle at night. These small details became my companions, my connection to the world beyond the island. And then one day, as I walked along the shore, something caught my eye. A piece of wreckage from the Venture, a small box, barely floating, half buried in the sand. My heart raced as I rushed over to it. It was a reminder of the life I had left behind, of the world I had once known. Inside the box, I found a few precious items, some letters, a small pocket knife, and a few scraps of food that had been preserved. It was a small victory, a tiny connection to the past. It didn't change the fact that I was alone, but it reminded me that I wasn't completely forgotten. Loneliness had become my constant companion on the island. But in the quiet, in the reflection, I had begun to understand myself in ways I never had before. The island had broken me down, but it had also rebuilt me. It had forced me to confront my own fears, my own desires, and my own loneliness. And in that solitude, I had found a kind of peace. I was no longer running from the world. I was living in it on my terms. The island had taken so much from me, but it had also given me something in return, myself. Chapter 7. The Dream of Return. As the months bled into each other, the island became both a prison and a sanctuary. It was a world of contradictions, vast and open, yet suffocating, wild and free, but harsh and unforgiving. My body had adapted to the rhythms of the land, the heat of the sun, the rain that came like a torrent, the ways of the animals that shared the island with me. But my mind? My mind was a different story. It was harder to tame. As I grew stronger physically, I found that I could no longer ignore the gnawing hunger within me, an emptiness that went beyond the food I ate, beyond the water I drank. It was the hunger for something more, something I could not put my finger on, but something that constantly lingered at the edges of my thoughts. The isolation had long since stopped feeling like a challenge. I had learned how to survive. I could hunt, fish, and build. I could make fire, craft tools, and find shelter. The island no longer felt like an overwhelming force. It was simply my reality. But in the quiet moments, when the day's work was done, I began to realize that I was not just surviving, I was yearning. Yearning for something I couldn't describe. Yearning for a life beyond this island. The nights were the hardest. There was something about the darkness that amplified everything. My thoughts, my doubts, my loneliness. The stars above, which I had once marveled at, now seemed to mock me. They were distant, untouchable, reminding me of how far away I was from home, from England, from everything that had once been familiar. The isolation was a shadow, always lingering, pressing down on me. I spent many of these long nights by the fire, staring into the flames, my mind drifting in and out of consciousness. I thought about the world I had left behind, the streets of London, the people I had known, the laughter of friends, the warmth of family. I thought about my parents, whether they still mourned my loss, whether they had accepted that I was gone forever. I thought about the dream I once had of exploring the world. I had sought adventure, but now all I wanted was to go home. Home. The word felt strange now. Was it still a place where I belonged? One night, as I lay on the ground, staring up at the stars, something strange happened. I fell asleep. But it wasn't just any sleep. It was a dream. A vivid, powerful dream that I would never forget. In the dream, I was standing at the edge of a vast, familiar ocean. The waters stretched endlessly before me, shimmering under a golden sun. The air was warm, filled with the scent of salt and seaweed, the gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore. I felt a sense of peace, a deep connection to the world around me. But there was something else, something that felt urgent, something that pulled me forward. I turned and saw a ship, the Venture. It was alive, whole, its sails billowing in the wind, the sound of its crew shouting orders. The ship was real, it was there, and it was waiting for me. My heart raced, my breath quickened. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. I ran toward the ship, my legs carrying me effortlessly across the sand. But just as I reached the dock, something happened. The ship, once so close, began to pull away. The ropes that tethered it to the dock snapped, and the ship began to drift out to sea. I ran faster, calling out, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. The ship was slipping away, faster than I could run, until it was nothing more than a speck on the horizon. I stood there, helpless, watching as the Venture disappeared into the vastness of the ocean, the waves swallowing it whole. And as I watched, a wave of sadness washed over me. I had been so close to returning, but now it was gone. The ship, my escape, had vanished. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The dream lingered in my mind, vivid and haunting. I sat up, my hands trembling as I ran them through my hair. The island was still there, silent and unyielding. The fire crackled softly in the darkness, but there was no ship, no promise of escape. Only the endless stretch of land, the thick jungle, and the vast ocean that seemed so far beyond my reach. But that dream, it had shaken something inside me. It had reignited a flame that I thought had long since died. I realized then that I could no longer live in this prison of my own making. I had to leave. The dream had shown me the way. I couldn't stay here forever. I couldn't let the island take away all the hopes and dreams I had once had. There had to be a way back. The idea of leaving the island terrified me. I had grown accustomed to it, had become a part of it, it had become my home in a way. I had learned its ways, had fought to survive within its confines, but it was no longer enough. I had to return to the world. I had to find my way back to England, back to the life I had once known, even if I wasn't sure what that life would be like anymore. The idea of escape consumed me in the days that followed. I began to prepare. The first thing I needed was a way off the island. The wreckage of the venture had given me a few materials, planks of wood, ropes, and nails, that might be useful in constructing a raft. But the sea was not kind, and I knew that any attempt to cross it would be a desperate one. A small, flimsy raft might not survive the unpredictable tides, the rough waves, or the sudden storms that seemed to come out of nowhere. But I was determined. I began gathering the materials I needed, carefully selecting the best wood for the structure. I would have to be resourceful, just as I had been with everything else on the island. I spent days working on the raft, using the skills I had learned to build something strong enough to carry me across the water. The work was slow, but with each passing day, the raft took shape. It was crude, but it was all I had. As I worked, my mind wandered back to the dream. The venture had been a symbol, I realized, not just of escape, but of the possibility of returning to the life I had left behind. The dream had shown me that I still had hope, that I could still find my way home. And that hope was enough to keep me going. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I could ever truly leave the island. There were days when the weight of my loneliness pressed down on me, and the island seemed like the only world I would ever know. But I couldn't give in to those feelings. I had a mission now, a dream of return. The dream had given me purpose, and with that purpose, I knew I could overcome any obstacle. Each day, as I worked on the raft, I thought about what awaited me on the other side of the ocean. England, my family, the life I had once known. But I also thought about what I would leave behind. The island had changed me in ways I couldn't fully understand. It had shaped me, had taught me things I never thought I would learn. It had given me a deeper understanding of who I was and what I was capable of. But now, I had to move forward. The island had been my prison, but it had also been my teacher, and I was ready to leave it behind. One night, as I sat by the fire, gazing out at the sea, I made a promise to myself. I would leave this island. I would return to the world, to my family, to the life I had once known. The dream had shown me that it was possible. And now, with the raft nearly complete, I could feel the promise of that return drawing closer. The journey would not be easy. The sea was vast, and the dangers of the island still loomed large in my mind. But I was ready. the dream of return, had sparked something inside me, a fire that could not be extinguished. I was going home. Chapter 8. The Mysterious Footprints. It had been weeks since I had set my plan into motion. My raft was nearly ready, and every day I worked tirelessly, preparing for the moment when I would finally leave this island. The dream of return had not only given me hope, but it had filled me with a sense of urgency. Every inch of progress made on the raft was a step closer to the life I had once known. I could almost hear the waves calling me, the ocean whispering promises of freedom. But, despite the preparations, something else lingered in the back of my mind. It was the mysterious footprints I had found in the sand several days ago. The discovery had unsettled me, though I hadn't fully understood why at the time. At first, I had thought little of it. Maybe it was a passing animal, or perhaps some other survivor, though I had convinced myself that no one could be stranded here with me. The island was vast and largely untouched by human presence. I was alone, or so I thought. The footprints had been large, unmistakably human, and fresh. They were different from anything I had seen on this island before. They were too deliberate, too purposeful. The shape of the foot suggested that whoever had left them was no stranger to walking in harsh conditions, as they left deep impressions in the soft sand. I had tried to push the thought aside. It was impossible. Who could be here? The wreck of the Venture had been the only ship for miles around, and I had seen no signs of other people. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more it nagged at me. And so, I decided to follow them. The footprints led me further into the jungle, beyond the areas I usually explored. The trees grew denser, the underbrush thicker, and soon I found myself standing at the edge of an area I had never seen before. It was a hollow, surrounded by tall trees and heavy vines that twisted like the arms of some ancient, forgotten creature. The silence here was different. It was thick, oppressive. Even the birds had stopped their calls, and the usual sounds of the island had been replaced by an eerie stillness. I knelt down and examined the ground closely. The footprints were clearer now, almost as if they had been waiting for me to find them. There was no mistaking the size and shape of the feet, and they seemed to be heading deeper into the heart of the jungle, where the trees were even older, their trunks gnarled and twisted. I stood up, my pulse quickening. The air felt heavier. Here, the weight of something unknown pressing against me. I had been alone for so long, and I knew the island's dangers, its wild creatures, the occasional treacherous terrain, and the unexpected storms. But this felt different. There was a presence here, something that felt not just natural, but intentional. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, to forget about the footprints, and focus on completing my raft. I had my escape almost within reach. But curiosity, that insistent spark, had already taken hold of me. I could not turn away. Something in those footprints, something in the way they were placed, told me that I was not alone on this island. I pressed on, moving through the thick jungle, trying to make as little noise as possible. I was cautious now, every step calculated. I didn't know what I was walking toward, but I could feel the tension in the air. The temperature had dropped, and the heavy humidity had given way to a strange, chill breeze that sent a shiver down my spine. I hadn't noticed it before, but now I could hear the faint rustling of something not human. The trail eventually led me to a small clearing, one that was not quite like any I had seen before. It was open, but surrounded by thick trees that formed a natural barrier. In the center, there was a large rock formation, jagged and imposing, almost as if it had been placed there for a reason. It was here that I found the second set of footprints, deeper and fresher than the first. I crouched down, my heart hammering in my chest. Something was wrong. It was then that I saw it. At the edge of the clearing, hidden behind a cluster of bushes, there was a figure. Not a shadow, not an illusion, but a person. Standing perfectly still, watching me. I couldn't make out any details. At first, just the silhouette of a man, or maybe a woman, clad in dark clothing that blended with the surroundings. The figure was tall and slender, but there was no mistaking the way they held themselves. Silent, purposeful. I froze, my body going rigid with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Had I truly found another survivor? Or was this someone, or something, else? Entirely? The figure didn't move at first. It seemed to study me, much as I had been studying the footprints. There was no hostility in their stance, but there was a coldness, an intensity, that made my skin crawl. It was as if they had been waiting for me to find them, to come to this very spot. My mind raced. What was this person doing on the island? How had they survived? And why hadn't I noticed them before? The island was large, but I had spent countless days exploring its every corner. If anyone had been living here, I would have seen them. Wouldn't I? I stood still for what felt like an eternity, unable to move. The figure remained silent, still as a rock, watching me with what I could only assume was caution. There was a long, charged silence between us. I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in their eyes, but before I could make sense of it, the figure turned and disappeared into the jungle, moving with a speed and grace that I could never have matched. For a moment I stood frozen, unsure of what had just happened. The presence that had gripped me was gone, replaced by a haunting emptiness. Had it been a hallucination? My mind playing tricks on me in the isolation? But no. I knew what I had seen. I had seen someone who was clearly alive and watching me. Someone who knew this island better than I ever would. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to follow, to find out who they were and why they had been so elusive. But at that moment, the island felt more dangerous than ever. It was no longer just the isolation that haunted me. It was the possibility that there were other forces at play here. That something or someone was waiting for me in the shadows. I stood in the clearing for a long time, pondering my next move. Should I venture deeper into the jungle and try to follow the mysterious figure? Or should I return to my shelter, to the safety of what I had already built, and focus on the escape I had been preparing for so long? The footprints were gone now, buried by the shifting sands of time, but they had left something behind. A question that lingered in my mind, gnawing at me. Was I truly alone on this island? And if not, who or what else was here? Chapter 9. Meeting the Stranger. The days following the discovery of the mysterious footprints were fraught with unease. The figure I had seen in the jungle kept appearing in my thoughts, like a shadow that refused to fade, no matter how hard. I tried to push it away. I could not ignore what I had witnessed. It was too real, too vivid. And it had raised questions that I could not answer. Who was this person? How had they managed to survive on this island? And why had they been so cautious, so deliberate in their movements? I had spent the past several days grappling with these questions, pacing around my shelter, mulling over my next steps. It was as if the island itself had suddenly become unfamiliar to me, a place I no longer controlled. I had been alone for so long that the idea of sharing it with someone or something else was unsettling. It was a feeling I couldn't shake. Had resolved that I would not let fear control me. I had survived this long on my own, and I would continue to do so. Yet, I could not help but feel that this encounter was inevitable, that I was being drawn to something far beyond my understanding. 1. Evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and orange, I decided to take a walk. The wind had picked up, a gentle breeze stirring the leaves of the trees, and the air felt fresher than usual. It was the perfect time to clear my mind, to refocus on my goal. Leaving this island. But as I wandered through the jungle, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. The quiet footsteps, soft and measured, seemed to follow me, always just behind. I turned my head, but there was no one there. I quickened my pace, and the footsteps did too. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was still again. The jungle had gone quiet. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves as the wind passed through the trees, but there were no other sounds, no birds, no animals, no sign of life. I stood frozen, listening. My eyes scanned the darkening shadows between the trees, and then I saw it. Movement, just at the edge of my vision. A figure, cloaked in the shadows, standing perfectly still. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, too curious, too frightened to move. My breath was shallow as I tried to steady my nerves. The figure stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, emerging from the darkness. At first, it was difficult to make out the details, but as the figure approached, I could see it clearly. A man, dressed in ragged clothes, his face partially covered by a weathered scarf. His skin was dark, weathered by the sun, and his hair was long, tangled in the way that only someone who had been living in isolation for far too long could have. His eyes were intense, piercing. They held something, a knowledge perhaps, or a recognition. But there was no aggression in his stance. He did not come at me with a weapon. He did not run. He simply stood there, watching me, waiting for me to make the first move. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us was thick, charged with the weight of the unknown. I didn't know whether to approach him or stay back. I had lived on this island alone for so long that the thought of another person, another human being, felt both like a blessing and a threat. Finally, the stranger spoke, his voice low and rough, as if he hadn't used it in years. "You are not from here," he said, his accent unfamiliar, yet oddly comforting. It was a strange, guttural tone, the kind of voice you might expect from someone who had lived in solitude for far too long. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I wasn't sure what to say. How could I explain my journey? How could I explain that I had been stranded on this island for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to speak to another person? The stranger didn't seem to expect an answer. He stepped closer, the last rays of sunlight catching his face, revealing the deep lines of age, the weathered skin, and the exhaustion that hung heavy around his features. There was no malice in his gaze, but there was a wariness, a caution, and a deep sadness, as if he too understood what it meant to be lost in this place. "I thought I was the only one," I finally managed to say, my voice a rasp. "How long have you been here?" The stranger regarded me for a moment, his eyes narrowing as though considering my question. "Too long," he replied simply. "Longer than I care to remember." He looked around, as though making sure we were still alone. "And I have been waiting for someone like you." I blinked, surprised by his words. "Someone like me?" I echoed, confusion washing over me. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head slightly, as if studying me. You are a man who has been broken by the sea. You came here seeking freedom, but now you found nothing but solitude. I froze. How did he know that? How could he possibly know what I had felt when I first arrived here? When I had set foot on this island with nothing but the desire to escape? He smiled slightly, as though he had read my thoughts. It's not hard to see, he said. I've seen many like you. They come, they survive, and they eventually realize that there is no escape. The island is not just a place. It's a prison. The word struck me hard, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. He was right. In all my years here, I had never thought of it that way. I had always told myself that the island was my chance, at a new beginning that someday, somehow, I would find a way to leave. But now, standing before this man, this stranger who had lived here far longer than I had, I realized that perhaps I had been fooling myself all along. The island had become a part of me, a part of my life I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. The stranger's expression softened, as though he understood the weight of my thoughts. You think you can leave, he continued. But the island will always pull you back. The sea is too vast. The island is too alive. You'll never escape it. Not completely. The words chilled me, but there was a certain truth in them. I had come here to escape, but now I wondered if I had only traded one prison for another. Why haven't you left? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. If you know all this, why have you stayed? The stranger's gaze grew distant, and I could see the shadows of pain flicker in his eyes. He looked away, as if the question was too much to bear. I stayed because I had no choice, he said quietly. The sea doesn't offer second chances. It takes what it wants, and it doesn't. Let go. I've tried to leave, but the island is where it wants me to be. There was a long silence between us, one that stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. The jungle seemed to grow quieter, as though it, too, was waiting for something to happen. Finally, the stranger stepped back, his eyes never leaving mine. You'll understand soon enough, he said, turning to walk deeper into the jungle. The island has a way of teaching lessons, whether you want to learn them or not. I stood there, watching him disappear into the shadows, a sense of unease settling deep in my chest. The island, it seemed, was more than just a place. It was a force, one that had trapped him, and perhaps one that was slowly trapping me as well. I didn't know what had just happened. I didn't know who this man was or how he had survived for so long. But one thing was clear. I was no longer alone on the island, and that, more than anything else, terrified me. Chapter 10. A Partnership. The following days passed in a blur of confusion, reflection, and silent tension. I had met the stranger, an experience that left me questioning not just my solitude on the island, but the very nature of my survival. I had been alone for so long that the idea of another person on this island felt strange, like a foreign concept that didn't quite belong. The stranger's words echoed in my mind constantly, especially the haunting idea that the island itself was alive. Alive in a way that could consume and trap even the strongest of wills. Despite my trepidation, I knew something had shifted within me. My mind, which had once clung to the hope of escape, now wrestled with the possibility that perhaps I had been wrong. I had spent so many years imagining that freedom lay just beyond the horizon, that the raft I had built would be my ticket out. But after meeting the stranger, I began to understand that survival here on the island was not about escaping. It was about surviving the island itself. The island had a strange hold on people, a way of making you feel both trapped and liberated at the same time. It wasn't long before I made the decision to find the stranger again. It wasn't just out of curiosity or the need for companionship. It was because, deep down, I knew he might be the only person who truly understood what it meant to live on this island. He knew its rhythms, its dangers, and most importantly, its lessons. If I was to truly survive, I needed to understand the island better. And he, it seemed, was my only link to that understanding. I set out early one morning, the sky still dark with the remnants of the night, and the air thick with the smell of the earth and salt water. I moved cautiously through the dense jungle, my eyes scanning for any sign of the man. I had learned quickly that this island was not forgiving. Every movement had to be purposeful, calculated. You couldn't let your guard down for even a moment. The journey was long and tiring, the underbrush thick and unforgiving. But after hours of searching, I found him. Sitting by a large rock near the edge of the jungle, his back turned toward me. He hadn't heard me approach. He was focused, intent on something in front of him, his hands working diligently at some task. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. But then I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed his help, and I needed to know more about him. More than that, I needed a partner. Someone who could teach me how to survive this island. Someone who could show me how to truly live on it. "Hey," I called out, my voice uncertain but firm. The man turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he sized me up. For a brief moment, the air between us felt thick with suspicion. His gaze was sharp, almost calculating. But then, after what seemed like an eternity, a slight smile crept onto his face. "You again?" he said, his voice rough, like gravel. "I didn't expect you to come back." I stood there for a moment, not knowing what to say. But then I realized the truth of it. I had come to him for help. There was no need for pretense, no need to hide my intentions. "I've been thinking," I began. "I've been here for so long, and I'm starting to wonder if I've been doing it all wrong. I thought I could escape the island, escape the life I left behind. But now, I'm not so sure. I think maybe it's time I learn from someone who's been here longer." The stranger didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood up, dusting off his hands and eyes still on me. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he was weighing my words, trying to determine if they held any truth. "I'm not a teacher," he said finally, his voice low. "The island doesn't teach in the way you want it to. It's not about comfort or lessons you can learn from a book. It's about survival, about adapting to the land and the sea, about learning when to fight and when to hide. The island doesn't care about your plans. It only cares about whether or not you can make it." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. He wasn't wrong. In all my time here, I had tried to force the island into a mold to make it fit my idea of what survival should be. But the island didn't work like that. It didn't care about what I wanted. It only cared about what I could endure. "So, what do I need to do?" I asked, the question burning in my throat. "I need to know. I need to learn how to survive here. Not just survive, but truly live. The island, it's not what I thought it would be." The stranger studied me for a long time, his gaze unwavering. He seemed to be looking for something in my eyes, something that would tell him whether I was truly ready to accept the realities of this place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he nodded. "All right," he said, his tone softening just a bit. "I'll teach you. But understand this, survival on this island is not a luxury. It's not about comfort or ease. It's about your ability to adapt, to become a part of this land, to live in harmony with it, or else it will swallow you whole. You can't fight it. You can only work with it." The words sent a chill through me, but they also ignited something deep inside, an understanding that I had been missing all along. I had been fighting the island. I had been fighting my circumstances, my solitude, my fear. But survival here wasn't about fighting. It was about surrendering. Surrendering to the land, to the water, to the rhythms that existed long before I ever set foot on this shore. And so, I began to learn. The stranger showed me how to find food more efficiently, how to fish in the waters without the tools I had been relying on, and how to hunt in ways that were respectful of the land rather than destructive. I learned how to read the signs of the island, how to listen to the wind, the trees, the tides. But most importantly, I learned how to live here, not just exist. The island became less of a prison and more of a place where I could learn, grow, and find my place in the world once again. I was no longer alone. I had a partner, someone who understood this place as I never could on my own. We spent our days working together, hunting, fishing, building. At night we sat by the fire, the crackling of the flames punctuating our conversations. He shared stories of his time on the island, of the things he had seen and done to survive. Some of his stories were harsh, others were tinged with sadness, but all were born from the deep knowledge he had gained in his time here. In time, I found myself beginning to trust him. It wasn't easy, and I knew that he was still a mystery to me in many ways. He had lived on this island far longer than I had, and there were things he knew that I couldn't begin to understand. But there was a bond forming between us, forged in the fires of survival. A partnership that made both of us stronger. I didn't know where this partnership would take us, or what the future held. But for the first time in years, I felt a sense of hope, a feeling that perhaps together we might be able to survive this island and the darkness that had once threatened to swallow me whole. And as the days passed, I realized that maybe, just maybe, the island had one more lesson to teach me. That survival wasn't just about living, it was about living with others. About finding strength in partnership, in shared experience, in learning from one another. The stranger and I had come together in a moment of necessity. But now, as the island stretched out before us, I began to understand that our bond could mean something more. It could mean a future, a new way of life, a life built not just on survival, but on the understanding that even in the harshest of places, the most unexpected partnerships can bloom. Chapter 11. Threats from the Sea. The days had begun to settle into a rhythm, one that, although still harsh, felt somewhat bearable. I had learned to trust the stranger, to accept that this island was my home, at least for the foreseeable future. Together, we worked in tandem, relying on each other to survive, to navigate this unpredictable world. But as the days passed and I became more accustomed to the island's rhythm, a new and more dangerous presence began to lurk just beyond the horizon. It started with the water. At first, I had only seen the ocean as a vast, unending expanse, a lifeline that separated me from the world I once knew. But as the seasons shifted, the sea became something more, something unpredictable, even hostile. The stranger had warned me that the sea was both a giver and a taker, a force to be respected, not just feared. The sea doesn't give mercy, he had said one evening, as we sat around a crackling fire. It gives no warnings. It just is. and if you're not careful, it will take everything. At the time, I hadn't understood, but now, with each passing day, I felt the weight of his words. The tides had started to grow more erratic, the winds stronger, and the storms more frequent. The once calm waters that I had used for fishing became treacherous. What had been a source of sustenance had now become a lurking danger, something that could turn against you in an instant. One morning, as I walked along the beach, my feet sinking into the damp sand, I noticed a change in the air. The breeze was different, heavier, more oppressive. The sky, once a bright expanse of blue, had grown overcast. The wind had picked up, pushing against the trees and making the leaves rustle ominously. It was an unsettling feeling, one that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Something was coming. I looked out at the horizon where the sea met the sky, and I saw it. Dark, swirling clouds gathering over the water. A storm was brewing. I knew from experience that when the sea gave no warning, it was often the prelude to something much worse. The stranger had taught me how to read the signs of the weather, how to recognize the subtle shifts that meant a storm was coming, and how to prepare. But there was something about this one that felt different. It felt more dangerous, more violent than anything I had witnessed before. I turned quickly and headed back to the shelter. The stranger was already there, his sharp eyes scanning the sky, his movements quick and efficient. He had noticed it too. Without a word, he grabbed the supplies we would need to secure the shelter. We worked together, reinforcing the structure, tying down the tarps, and ensuring that the firewood was covered. The rain would come fast, but it wasn't the rain that concerned us. It was what the storm would bring with it. By the time we had finished preparing, the sky had darkened completely, and the wind had begun to howl, bending the trees under its force. The sea, which had once been calm, was now roiling violently, the waves crashing against the shore like an angry beast. I could hear the thunder in the distance, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to shake the very earth beneath my feet. We huddled in the shelter, listening to the storm's fury as it lashed against the island. The sound of the wind was deafening, and the rain came in sheets, drenching everything in its path. But even as the storm raged outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sea wasn't just angry, it was more than that. It felt like a warning. The stranger had been right. The island had a way of teaching lessons, and the sea was a relentless teacher. The storm lasted through the night, its fury unabated, and by morning, the sky had cleared. The calm after the storm was almost eerie, the air still thick with moisture. But it wasn't the peacefulness that caught my attention. It was the smell. Something had changed. A sharp, salty tang filled the air, different from the usual scent of the sea. I stepped outside, my feet sinking into the wet sand, and I saw it. The beach was littered with debris, branches, leaves, and the remnants of broken trees. But there was something else. Scattered across the shore were large, jagged rocks, many of them jagged and sharp. And amidst the wreckage, I saw something even more unsettling. Tracks, deep, wide, and unmistakably human. They were fresh, the edges still wet from the storm, and they led from the water's edge into the jungle. I froze, the blood draining from my face. The footprints, the ones I had seen days ago, were back. But this time, they weren't just footsteps in the sand. These were signs of something much more deliberate, something much more sinister. Before I could react, the stranger appeared at my side, his face grim. He had seen it too. "It's them," he said quietly, his voice tinged with dread. "The sea. It's not just the weather. They come with it. Every time." I stared at him, not understanding. Who was they? What did he mean? He looked. Out at the ocean, the waves still rolling in with a force that seemed almost deliberate, as if the sea itself was pushing something, or someone, toward us. "Pirates," he muttered. "They've been here before. They know the island, and they'll come again." A chill ran down my spine. I had heard of pirates before, vicious men who plundered ships and raided islands, leaving nothing but destruction in their wake. But to think that they had come here, to this island, was something I hadn't considered. The stranger's face hardened as he looked back at the footprints. "We need to prepare," he said. "They won't stop until they've taken what they want, and they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." Panic surged through me, but I forced it down. We had survived this long. We could survive this too. But I knew, in my gut, that this was different. The island had already tested me. Now the sea was testing us. And the threat wasn't just nature. It was something far more dangerous, far more human. We gathered what we needed: weapons, supplies, and the tools that would give us a fighting chance. But I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on us. The storm had passed, but its effects lingered. The sea was no longer just a source of life. It was a harbinger of violence. We had to be ready. For the first time since my arrival, I began to realize the true power of the island. It wasn't just the isolation, the wildlife, or the storms that made it dangerous. It was the unpredictability of it all. The island could change in an instant, and the very sea that separated me from the world could bring enemies to my doorstep. The stranger's words haunted me as we finished preparing. The island doesn't give mercy, and neither do they. We waited, each of us knowing what was coming next, each of us prepared to face the threats that the sea had brought. The calm of the morning was only temporary. The true test was yet to come. Chapter 12. The Escape Plan. The days that followed the storm were heavy with anticipation. The signs were clear. Pirates were approaching. Their presence no longer a vague threat, but an undeniable reality. The tracks in the sand, the remains of their wreckage, the looming presence of the sea, it all pointed toward one conclusion. We were no longer safe. The island, which had once felt like my refuge, was now a cage, and the pirates were coming to claim it. For the first time since my arrival, I allowed myself to feel fear, not the fleeting fear of the unknown, but a deep primal terror. The kind of fear that gnaws at you, a relentless, suffocating presence that burrows into your mind and refuses to leave. I had spent so many years convincing myself that I could survive, that this island could be my home, that I had a plan. But now my world was about to be turned upside down. I had to face the truth. Survival here didn't just mean living off the land. It meant fighting for my life. I knew I wasn't alone in this. The stranger had been with me through every trial, every struggle. Together, we had learned the ways of the island, and together, we would face whatever dangers it brought. But now, we had a new challenge. We couldn't just survive. We had to escape. We had discussed the possibility of leaving the island before, but it had always seemed like a distant dream, something for the future, something I could hope for but never truly plan for. The sea, with its unpredictable tides and relentless storms, had kept us trapped here. And yet, as the days passed and the pirate threat grew more imminent, I realized that staying was no longer an option. The stranger was the first to bring up the idea of escape. We were sitting by the fire one evening, the crackling of the wood, the only sound breaking the silence, when he turned to me, his face serious. "We need to leave," he said, his voice low. "The pirates will be here soon, and when they arrive, we won't be able to defend ourselves. They'll kill us without hesitation." I stared at him, the weight of his words settling in. I had known this day would come, the day when I had to choose between staying and fighting, or leaving and risking everything. But now that the decision was before me, I realized just how difficult it was. The sea had always felt like an enemy, and now it would be our only way out. "How do we get away?" I asked, my voice almost a whisper. The question felt absurd. How could we escape from an island in the middle of the sea? How could we outrun the pirates? The stranger's eyes darkened. "I've been watching the tides, watching the currents. There's a way out, but it's not easy. It's going to take everything we have." I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do we need to do?" He explained the plan, step by step. The first part was to get a boat, something that could carry us away from the island. The sea was too vast to cross without proper equipment, and our small raft would never survive the journey. We needed something sturdy, something that could withstand the stormy seas. "There's a small cove to the east," he said, pointing to the map we had drawn of the island. "I've seen abandoned fishing boats there. They won't be much, but they're our best chance. We can use them to get out of here." I nodded, understanding the urgency of the situation. "We'll need supplies, food, water, weapons. We can't risk being unprepared." The stranger agreed. "We'll have to gather everything we can carry. The island's resources won't last long once the pirates arrive. We need to move fast." We spent the following days preparing. The first task was to gather supplies, water, food, and anything else we could carry that would help us survive the journey. I gathered dried fish, salted meat, fruit, and as much fresh water as I could store. We also made sure to pack the weapons we had, my knife, a spear, and the few tools we had managed to scavenge from the wreckage of previous storms. I didn't know how much they would help, but I couldn't afford to be without them. The stranger focused on the boat. We knew that the cove would be dangerous. Pirates were likely to have passed through the area, but we had no other choice. We couldn't risk staying on the main beach where we might be spotted. We would have to be swift, silent, and prepared for whatever we might find. As we worked, the tension between us grew palpable. There was a sense of urgency in every task we completed, every item we packed. The pirate threat loomed large, and each passing day brought us closer to the moment of truth. We both knew that if we didn't leave soon, we might never get the chance again. Finally, the day arrived. We had gathered everything we needed, and the boat was ready. It wasn't much, just a small fishing boat that looked like it had been abandoned years ago, but it was sturdy enough for the journey ahead. We loaded it with our supplies, securing everything as best as we could. Before we set out, we shared a quiet moment by the fire. There were no words between us, just a deep understanding that this would be our last night on the island, whether we succeeded or not. The stranger didn't speak much, but I could tell he was preparing himself, mentally and physically, for what lay ahead. We had come a long way from the days when we had been strangers to each other. Now we were partners, bound together by the harsh reality of survival. "We'll make it," I said, breaking the silence. My voice was steady, but inside my heart was racing. "We have to." The stranger looked at me, his expression unreadable. "We'll make it," he said, his voice just as firm. "But we need to stay focused. The pirates won't stop. They'll come for us. And when they do, we need to be ready." With that, we began our journey. We moved quickly and quietly, making our way to the cove under the cover of darkness. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the jungle, making it easier for us to navigate without being seen. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was muffled by the dense foliage, but I could feel the tension in the air. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. When we reached the cove, the boat was waiting for us. It was small, but it was our only chance. We pushed it into the water, our hearts pounding in our chests, the adrenaline coursing through our veins. I could hear the distant sound of the ocean, the waves rolling in, but now they sounded different, more menacing, as if they knew we were trying to escape. With the boat loaded and our supplies secure, we set sail, leaving the island behind. The sea was calm at first, the water smooth as we navigated our way through the darkened waters. But the feeling of uncertainty lingered, as if the island itself were watching us, waiting for us to falter. As we sailed into the open ocean, I realized that there was no turning back. The island, the pirates, everything that had been my life for so long was now behind me. And ahead of us, the vast, unpredictable sea stretched out, a world of possibilities and dangers waiting to be discovered. The escape had begun, but the real challenge was just ahead. The pirates would not let us go so easily, and the sea with all its power would test us in ways we could never have imagined. Chapter 13. The Return to the World. We had escaped. We had left the island behind, a memory fading with each passing wave. The boat, though small, had carried us away from the peril of the pirates and the unknown of the island into the uncertain expanse of the open sea. The dark waters stretched endlessly before us, and as we sailed, a deep sense of both relief and trepidation washed over me. The island that had been my prison, my home, was now a mere speck in the distance. It felt surreal, unbelievable that we had made it this far. Yet, as much as I was grateful to be free of the island's grip, the ocean itself was far from forgiving. The sea, for all its beauty, was just as much a threat as the land had been. The calm waters we had first encountered soon gave way to the capricious nature of the open sea. The winds picked up, the waves grew larger, and a sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. It was as if the sea, sensing our newfound freedom, wanted to reclaim us. But I couldn't allow myself to focus on the danger. I had to believe that this was the beginning of something new, something bigger than the life I had left behind. For so long, I had been focused on survival, the day-to-day struggle for food, water, and shelter on the island. But now, with the island behind us and the vast ocean ahead, the weight of that struggle was slowly starting to lift. This was a journey to a new life, a return to the world I had once known. We sailed for days, the routine becoming second nature. The stranger, always the more experienced of us, steered the boat with a steady hand, reading the stars to guide us, understanding the currents, the tides, and the subtle shifts in the wind. I learned quickly from him, watching how he moved with the ocean, how he read its language. And as the days turned into weeks, I felt a change within myself. I was no longer the man who had washed ashore, desperate for survival. I was becoming someone new, someone who had learned the true meaning of resilience. But even as I grew stronger, the memories of the island, the struggle, and the pirates haunted me. I had to push these thoughts aside. The threat of the pirates was never far from my mind. I knew they would be looking for us, searching the seas for any sign of our escape. They had no reason to stop, no reason to rest until they found us and took what they believed was rightfully theirs. As we sailed further, we encountered more ships, some small and some large, but none of them seemed to pose a threat. The stranger kept a watchful eye on the horizon, never letting his guard down, always alert to the possibility of danger. The sea was vast, but it was not empty. We had been free from the island, but the world we had returned to was still filled with challenges. The unknown stretched out in front of us, and we would have to face it head-on, with no guarantee of safety or success. The real test came when we finally sighted land. After weeks at sea, the sight of land was both exhilarating and overwhelming. The coastline was a mixture of rocky cliffs and sandy beaches, and as we approached, I could feel the pulse of anticipation building within me. I had spent so long dreaming of returning to the world I had left behind, but now, seeing it in the distance, I was uncertain. What had changed since my time on the island? How much of the world I remembered still existed? The closer we got, the more I realized how much I had changed. I wasn't the same man who had left. The island had shaped me, had forced me to adapt and grow. I had learned things about myself, about survival, about the world. But now, as we approached the shores of civilization, I had to ask myself, was I ready to rejoin that world? Could I find my place again? Or had the island changed me so much that I no longer belonged? We anchored the boat in a small bay and disembarked, our feet meeting solid ground once again. The feeling of sand beneath my toes was strange, almost surreal. I hadn't felt it in so long. The air smelled different, fresher, with the scent of salt water and earth mixing together. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the richness of the world beyond the island. It felt like a dream, too good to be true. We made our way inland, our supplies low but manageable. The stranger led the way, confident in his movements, while I followed closely behind, still absorbing the enormity of what we were about to face. The world was so much bigger than I remembered. The sounds of birds and distant voices reminded me that life continued, that the world was moving on, even while I had been trapped in that isolated existence. We reached a small village after hours of walking. It wasn't much, but it was a place that felt alive. There were people, men and women, going about their business, talking, laughing, living. The sight of them, so ordinary, so unremarkable, was a shock to my senses. How had I lived without this for so long? How had I existed without these simple yet profound connections? I knew I couldn't stay here forever. I had no place in this village. I was a stranger, an outsider, someone who had spent years living alone on an island. But for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. Hope that I could find my way back, that I could rebuild my life, that I could find my place in this world once more. The people in the village were kind, offering food and shelter for the night. I could tell they were curious about us, about where we had come from, but no one asked too many questions. They saw two men who had clearly been through something, and their silence spoke volumes. They knew what it was like to face hardship, to survive in the world. That night, as I lay in a bed for the first time in years, I realized that the journey wasn't over. The island had been just one chapter, a harsh, unforgiving chapter in a much longer story. And though I had returned to the world I once knew, I knew now that I had much more to learn. The world was vast, full of endless possibilities, but also dangers, challenges, and opportunities for growth. I wasn't sure where my journey would take me next, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't the man who had left England so long ago. I had survived, I had grown, and I had learned. And now I was ready to embrace whatever came next. The island had changed me, but the world had a way of changing people even more. And it was time for me to take my place in it, to live the life I had once dreamed of, to make up for lost time. The escape was just the beginning. The real adventure was about to unfold. Chapter 14: A Changed World. The world I stepped back into was one I had once known but could no longer recognize. The land that had been so familiar to me before, the bustling streets of London, the familiar faces of old acquaintances, now felt distant, foreign. It was as though I had awoken from a long, strange dream, only to find that everything had changed. I had arrived back in England after years of isolation, of surviving on an island where the world was defined by nothing more than the rhythm of the tides, the taste of salt in the air, and the unforgiving demands of nature. Now, with the island behind me, I was in a world brimming with life, with people, with noise, a world that moved too quickly, too unpredictably for me to keep up. It wasn't just the landscape that had changed. It was me. The man who had walked onto that island was different from the man who stood here, on the edge of civilization. I had grown stronger in ways I never thought possible, mentally and physically. But now, with the noise of the city surrounding me, with the endless bustle of people, I could feel my solitude creeping back in. For all the change, for all the progress, I was still the same man who had spent years alone on an island. A stranger in his own land. As I walked through the streets of London, the sound of horse-drawn carriages clattering against cobblestone streets, the chatter of people haggling in markets, and the scent of fresh bread from bakeries flooded my senses. It was overwhelming. The world was in motion, vibrant with life, and I felt a part of it. But I also felt completely out of place. The faces I passed by, the conversations I overheard, all seemed so alien to me now. It wasn't just the clothes they wore or the way they moved, so quick, so assured. It was the way they lived. They were moving forward, full of purpose, while I had been caught in a timeless pause on the island, just trying to survive. I found a tavern that looked familiar, a place I had visited years ago with friends, a place where laughter and music once filled the air. The sign above the door was the same, but now it felt foreign. When I entered, the noise was deafening, the clinking of mugs, the sound of feet shuffling across the floor, the low hum of conversation. People turned to glance at me, their eyes flicking over me, curiosity mixed with indifference. I wasn't the man they remembered. I had changed too much. I ordered a drink and sat down in the corner, feeling like an outsider in a place that had once been my refuge. The bartender smiled, recognizing me from before. But when I looked at him, I saw no familiarity in his eyes, no understanding of the years that had passed since I last walked through this door. I was no longer the man who had laughed with friends over drinks. The man I had been was lost somewhere back in time, replaced by the hardened survivor who had returned from an island no one could truly comprehend. As I sipped my drink, memories of the island crept into my mind. The fire I had built, the struggle to find food and shelter, the ever-present threat of isolation. These were not memories of a distant past, but of a life I had lived only days ago. I had escaped, but part of me was still on that island, still fighting to survive. The world I had returned to felt like a distant dream. I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong here. I spent several days in London, adjusting, or at least trying to. I had no place in the world I had returned to, no friends, no family waiting for me. My parents were gone, and my sister, the only family I had left, was a distant memory. I wandered the streets, sometimes aimlessly, searching for something familiar. I visited the old market, the places I had once known, but everything seemed so much smaller now. The people I had known were gone, replaced by strangers who went about their lives without a second glance at the man who had once been one of their own. I tried to reach out, tried to speak to people, but it was as though I was speaking a different language. I wasn't sure how to re-enter this world, how to fit back into the mold I had once filled. I had learned to live with nothing, to create my own survival, my own purpose. Now I was expected to be part of a world that had its own rules, its own expectations, and I felt lost. But there was something that still clung to me. Hope. It wasn't gone, not entirely. I had lived through so much, survived against all odds. I had learned things on that island that I could never have imagined before. I knew that I wasn't the same man who had left this world. I had survived when I thought I would never see the world again. That survival, that will to live, had changed me in ways I could not yet fully understand. One afternoon, I made my way to a small estate on the outskirts of London, a place I had inherited, or so I thought, though my memory of the details was hazy. Years of isolation had dulled much of what I once knew. I had no expectations, only the desire to see something, anything, that might connect me back to the life I had once had. The estate, when I arrived, was in ruins. The once proud house now stood in disrepair, its windows shattered, its walls cracked. The garden, once carefully tended, was overgrown with weeds. It was as though time had abandoned it, just as it had abandoned me. I stood there for a moment, taking in the desolation. I was no stranger to desolation. I had lived in a place far worse, but something about this felt final. This place, this home, was no longer mine. I sat down on the steps of the crumbling porch and stared out at the horizon, trying to make sense of the past, of the time I had spent on the island, and of the world I had returned to. I had hoped to find something familiar, some connection to the life I once had, but I realized in that moment that there was nothing for me here. My past was gone, swept away like the wreckage of a storm. The island had changed me, reshaped me, and now I was someone new, standing in a world that no longer recognized me. And yet, despite the weight of it all, there was still a flicker of something inside me, a spark of hope, of determination that refused to die. I had made it through the island. I had survived. And as I sat there, alone in the ruins of my past, I made a decision. I would rebuild. Not just the estate, but my life. The world had changed, and I had changed with it, but there was still room for me here. I would find my place, carve out a new path in this world, just as I had done on that island. The journey wasn't over. The world had changed, but so had I. And now, it was time for me to reclaim my future, to shape it into something that was mine. The island had been the beginning of my transformation, but the world, this changed world, would be the place where I would truly rebuild. Chapter 15: New Beginnings. The days following my return to England were filled with a quiet kind of reflection. I had learned so much in the years I spent on that island, lessons about survival, resilience, and the importance of inner strength. But now, as I stood in the midst of a bustling, thriving world that seemed to have moved on without me, I was overwhelmed. The person I had become was not the same person who had once walked the streets of London. Yet here I was, a stranger in my own world, attempting to find my place again. The city had changed. The roads that I once walked felt narrower, the buildings taller, the noise louder. People moved with purpose, speaking in hurried tones, their faces set with determination. I, on the other hand, was still grappling with the vastness of it all. I felt like a ghost, floating between the familiar and the foreign, searching for a way back into the life I had left behind. But somewhere deep inside, I knew that what had been lost could never truly be regained. I wasn't the same man anymore. The island had done that, had forged a new version of me, one that had endured hardships I never thought I could survive. But with this new man came new opportunities. I knew that my life wasn't over, that there were still chances to make a difference, to carve out a new future. The island had taught me one invaluable lesson. I could rebuild. And rebuilding, as daunting as it seemed, was the only option I had now. I began with small steps, reintroducing myself to the world I had once known. I spent the first few days simply wandering the streets, watching people go about their business, listening to their conversations, trying to reconnect with the world. It was a difficult process. Everywhere I went, I felt the weight of my solitude. I had learned to live without human connection for so long that now, surrounded by people, I felt more isolated than ever. But I couldn't give in to that feeling. I had come this far, and I would not allow myself to be swallowed up by the world that once felt so familiar. As I walked, I stumbled upon a familiar sight. A small bookstore tucked away in a corner, hidden from the hustle and bustle of the main road. It was a place I had frequented in my youth, a quiet retreat where I could escape into the world of books, where the real world faded away. I had spent countless hours there, reading stories of adventure, of far-off lands and great quests. It felt almost serendipitous, as though the universe was guiding me back to something I had once loved. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of paper and ink filling my nostrils. The space was small, cozy, and dimly lit. A few people were scattered around the shelves, lost in their own worlds. I could feel the tension in my shoulders begin to ease, the quiet comfort of the bookstore wrapping around me like a warm blanket. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of books, feeling the weight of history, of knowledge, of stories. There was something timeless about it, something that grounded me in the midst of all the change. And then, as if by chance, my eyes landed on a book I had read years ago, before my life had been turned upside down by the island. It was a story of survival, of overcoming impossible odds, of finding hope in the darkest of places. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed, but it was the same book that had once sparked my own sense of adventure. A smile tugged at my lips as I pulled it from the shelf, the weight of it in my hands familiar and comforting. I walked to the counter to purchase the book, the young woman behind the register offering me a polite smile. She seemed like she was in a hurry, as most people were these days, but there was kindness in her eyes. I paid for the book, and as she handed me the change, I asked, "Do you have any books on survival, on overcoming challenges?" She raised an eyebrow but nodded. "We have a section in the back for that kind of thing," she said. "You'll find books on everything: survival, self-reliance, adventure." I thanked her and made my way to the back of the store where the bookshelves seemed to stretch on forever. I picked up a few books, skimming through the pages, reading snippets of advice, of wisdom from those who had faced the same kind of challenges I had. As I stood there, surrounded by the words of others, I realized something profound. The stories of survival, the struggles I had faced on that island, were not mine alone. People had faced hardship throughout history, and they had survived. They had come out on the other side stronger, wiser, and so could I. I walked out of the bookstore with a renewed sense of purpose. The world, though different, still had a place for me. I didn't know exactly where I fit in, but I was determined to find it. I had a life to rebuild, a future to forge, and I wasn't about to let the past hold me back. The island had shaped me, had turned me into someone new. But it was time to move forward. It was time to create my own destiny, to carve out a new life for myself, a life that was no longer defined by the hardships of the past. Over the next few weeks, I immersed myself in the world around me. I sought out people who shared my interests, people who had survived their own struggles, who had overcome obstacles. I found work, small tasks at first, just enough to get by. But every day I felt myself growing, expanding. The more I interacted with the world, the more I realized that I was capable of much more than I had ever thought possible. I began to feel the stirrings of a new identity, a new life rising within me. I wasn't the man who had been stranded on that island. I was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had learned the value of resilience and perseverance. And as I looked toward the future, I realized that the world I had returned to was just another adventure, one that I was ready to face head-on. As the months passed, I became more confident in my new life. I started to take on bigger challenges, to push myself further than I had ever imagined. The journey that had begun on the island was not over. It had simply evolved. I had learned that survival was not just about physical endurance, but about mental strength, adaptability, and the willingness to embrace change. The island had been a crucible, shaping me into someone who could face any challenge the world threw my way. I didn't know what the future held, but I no longer feared it. The world was a place full of possibilities, full of new beginnings. And I, the man who had once been lost, had finally found his place in it. Great work today. Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.